He vanished without a trace. But she knew. Welcome to My Night Detective. I am your host, Elderwick. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Your voices make these mysteries unforgettable. Let's begin. The bells had already sounded the hour when I found myself once again in the Randolph bar, staring at the condensation on the outside of a half-finished pint and trying not to count how many crosswords I had abandoned unfinished over the years. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and tobacco, though neither had been present for some time, and through the windows the yellow smudge of lamplight trembled against the first touch of evening rain. It was Oxford at its most familiar. Damp stone, uncertain shadows, and the rustling presence of undergraduates still young enough to laugh loudly without hearing the echo of their own loneliness. I should have gone home. There was music I had meant to listen to, and a letter from the utilities company that demanded at least a glance. But habit is a subtle tyrant, and mine led me to this seat beneath the gilt-framed portrait of some forgotten mayor. The crossword lay folded beside the glass, its clues scribbled over in fits of irritation. One had caught me earlier in the day and refused to let go. What remains when nothing remains? 7. I had circled it twice and left it blank. Absence has a way of resisting definition. Lewis would have said that such things were a waste of time, that the world contained enough practical puzzles without inventing new ones in the back pages of newspapers. And yet I have always distrusted puzzles that declare themselves solvable. The real ones seldom do. I read idly through the small notices, the academic appointments, the half-hearted advertisements for rooms to let, the reports of last night's football, and there, wedged between the announcement of a faculty recital and a lecture on medieval heresies, a few sentences described the sudden death of Dr. Adrian Milor, Fellow of St. Anselm's College, who had been found in his rooms earlier that week. A tragedy, it was called. An accident, perhaps. I let my eyes rest upon the line, but my mind drifted elsewhere. Milor. The name struck a faint, elusive chord, as if recalled from a conversation overheard in another lifetime. The rain thickened outside, running in faint rivers across the panes. I drained the pint and ordered another, the second always easier than the first. The barman moved with the indifference of someone who had seen too many solitary men rehearsing their regrets. I've never liked to be observed when drinking, so I bent again to the crossword, as though the page itself might shield me. Later, when the room had begun to empty, I remembered the obituary with a sharper clarity. Mellor had been a scholar of the Romantics, Keats especially, though more often admired for his charm than his scholarship. I thought of St. Anselm's, that quiet backwater of a college, its library, damp with forgotten volumes, its fellows better known for committees than contributions, and I thought of the word absence again, of what remains when nothing remains. It was only as I stood to leave that I noticed the faint smear of ink upon my thumb, where the crossword had rubbed against the glass. A trivial detail, yet I could not shake it. Words leave their trace even when no one means them to. Mellor had left his somewhere, though I could not yet imagine where or why. I walked back across Beaumont Street, the pavement shining in the lamplight, my coat collar turned against the drizzle. The city breathed its old melancholy, bicycles chained to railings, the glimmer of stained glass high above, the muffled footsteps of some student hurrying towards a deadline that would soon be forgotten. I felt again the familiar tug of solitude, that quiet ache that deepens rather than diminishes with company. By the time I reached the flat, the crossword clue had returned with the persistence of a refrain. 7 letters. Nothing remains. The answer, I realized, was silence. And in that silence, somewhere behind the guarded gates of St. Anselm's, a man had died without fanfare. I poured myself a small whiskey and let the sound of the rain settle into the room. One can never know in such moments which death will demand attention and which will drift away like smoke. Yet I sensed, without reason, that Mellor's end would not be easily dismissed. He had left no trace, perhaps, but traces are rarely what they seem. Keeping the same tone and pacing. Morning came thin and grey, the kind of light that makes a teacup feel heavier than it should, and the post less forgiving. I had left the crossword on the kitchen table as if it might warm the room by association. Silence I had written in the margin, and found the word neither satisfied nor complete. I was thinking of cooled bath water and the name Mellor when footsteps paused in the communal corridor with that unhurried certainty I knew too well. Lewis had learned to walk softly in buildings where the floors remember Latin declensions. He said he was passing anyway, which meant he had seen something he would not trust to the telephone. A letter had arrived at the station, addressed to no one, and the desk sergeant had laid it aside with the day's quarrels. I asked whether it belonged to the tribe that writes in capitals. No, he said, it belonged to the tribe that buys decent paper and knows how to stop. From his pocket he produced an envelope so ordinary that it almost apologized for existing. We opened it at the table. 2 lines only. He left no trace. She knew his secret. Nothing else. Not a name. Not a flourish. Not the soft vanity of a signature. The hand was neat without being precious, a rightward lean like someone bending to hear a remark. Lewis said crank, then student, then jealous colleague. He was willing to rent out motive to the highest bidder. I said most jokes arrive in larger boxes, and jealousy seldom folds itself so small. We took the letter to the window. Beneath the words ran the faint ribs of ruled paper. The sheet had been torn along perforations. No indentations on the back, no corrections, no hesitation. I lifted it to my face. Nothing but the clean breath of soap. People betray themselves by smell as reliably as by syntax. This correspondent offered neither. Lewis suggested we drive to St. Anselm's and let the dons deny everything in better English. I asked him to tell me what he saw that I had not. He peered again and said the full stop after trace seemed darker, as if the pen had paused there. Good, I told him. The writer meant the sentence to finish with a click. What does that give us? He asked. Only the intention to separate the public from the private, I said. Evidence first. Sentiment later. There are mornings when Oxford seems folded from thin paper, all its colleges and quarrels creased into the illusion of permanence. We walked to the car through new rain. The city smelled of damp wool and bruised leaves. While Lewis drove, I considered the rhythm of the message. He left no trace belongs to the forensic imagination. She knew his secret belongs to bedrooms and vestries. Evidence and memory on adjacent lines. If the writer wished us to think of 2 people, we ought to consider the possibility that the second watched the first vanish without moving from her chair. At St. Anselm's, the porter listened gravely and pretended to recognize my name while forgetting Lewis's. The flagstones held the night's wetness like modest grief. I asked, almost idly, whether Dr. Mellor drank tea. The porter said coffee and brandy in the evenings. Not together, sir. Chalk dust clung to his cuff. Somewhere a notice board had been revised. We were sent to Mellor's staircase. I carried the letter in my coat like a minor confession. In the rooms the bath lay emptied, a pale ring showing where the water had reached and lost its nerve. A towel hung with the tragic tidiness of the newly dead. On the basin, I noted the absence of shaving foam. Hurried men make foamy mistakes. On the desk, a slim notebook lay under a tired Keats. The pages were unruled, creamy, a little too proud of their texture. I laid the anonymous sheet upon one page and watched how its lines refused to align with anything at all. Whoever wrote had used a lined pad. Whoever lived here liked paper that never tells you where to put yourself. Lewis rehearsed the coroner's opinion. Accident, bath, late night, brandy. He asked what I thought. I said accidents seldom announce themselves twice. He asked about the second line. It sounded to him like the sort of secret that gathers witnesses, not whispers. I told him knowledge has its own gravity. Some facts are kept not by caution, but by shame. We left the rooms. In the stairwell, a forgotten cloak peg held a scrap of blue thread so small I almost lost it to my breath. I pinched it and let it rest on my palm. The porter, summoned with reluctant ceremony, said the college had a costume society, rehearsals on Thursdays. It was Friday. I said nothing. He smiled as if we had paid him a compliment. Outside, the rain thinned to a mist that made the stone seem younger. Lewis asked whether the letter changed anything. "Only the order in which we shall listen," I said. "First to the silence that leaves no trace, then to the person who heard it perfectly." He asked if I meant the widow. I said I did not know yet, and felt, unhelpfully, that I already did. St. Anselm's announced itself in the old Oxford way, with a gatehouse that frowned at strangers and a porter whose voice had learned drizzle. He remembered me ostentatiously, and remembered Lewis only when the ledger required it. Hierarchies write themselves on faces before ink confirms them. We signed, our pens scratching like polite mice, and crossed a quad scented with rain-dark ivy and extinguished candles. Somewhere, a rehearsal piano practiced remorse. Mellor's staircase faced north and kept its cold like a vow. The rooms had been tidied with institutional piety, a cleared desk, a virtuous bath, a bin translated into innocence. I moved among uncooperative witnesses. Keats lay open, marginalia, prim to hypocrisy. One leaf was surgically absent. I thought of our letter. 2 sentences walking like cloistered brothers, evidence and memory keeping their wary distance. Lewis returned from the bursary with the arid charity of administration. The widow would be at home after 4. Professor Channing presently lecturing on textual corruptions. Dr. Helena Voss within reach, supervising in the looser, older sense. Ethics of attribution, he muttered, as if the phrase were an unripe pear. I asked for Mellor's borrowing history. Sacred, came the word, as though libraries required incense. Churches have disclosed more for less. We found Voss in a corridor where ancestral portraits leaned forward to eavesdrop. Her tailoring spoke fluent blue. Her voice rationed adjectives. She called Mellor charming when sober and tiresome when clever, a man who reached for Keats to seem tender and for Coleridge to seem deep. Lately, she said, he had become attentive to the way ideas change hands. She allowed the sentence to germinate in silence. I asked whether change meant theft. The Academy, she replied, disliked crude nouns and preferred explanations that sounded like apologies. She watched my face as if measuring its appetite for consolation. In the library threshold waited Michael Hartley, quick-eyed and raw-edged, promise learning its predators. Mellor had been reading his chapters and had mislaid them, he volunteered. Mislaid is an anesthetic administered before the sharper word. A freckle of ink marked his right cuff. A notepad leaf, ragged from perforations, peered from his folder like a rib beneath skin. I asked where he had written last night. His rooms, then perhaps the common room, then his rooms again. The stammer belonged not to language, but to memory discovering it had rearranged itself. Channing received us in an office that smelt of varnish and comparison. Mellor, he said, was a competent popularizer. There had been a difference of opinion about preferment. In communities of minds, such differences are inevitable. Inevitability, I told him, makes a serviceable alibi. He smiled with the leisure of tenure and offered his profile to the window. When I asked if he had visited Mellor after Hall, he aligned a paper knife as if adjusting a principle and said he had not. By late afternoon, the college wore that exhausted brightness peculiar to places where nothing publicly occurs and everything privately advances. I returned alone to Mellor's rooms. On the mantel, a photograph showed Mellor facing the camera with courteous caution. Beside him, younger by several lives, Voss with a looseness absent from her present grammar. Dust ringed the frame in a clean crescent, as if it had been moved and carefully restored. The bookcase yielded a narrow, clean groove across two shelves, not quite parallel with anything. Books forget their neighbors reluctantly. This gap felt recently bereaved. Even the dust seemed careful about forgetting today. At the desk I read the marginalia again. A line from Coleridge had been rendered with a tender betrayal. Not life is but a dream's shadow. Life is a vision. Voss would not permit such imprecision. Mellor might, if quoting her voice and not the page. Someone had taught him the wrong line, and he had preferred the teacher to the truth. That small faithlessness glowed more than any candle, and I set it beside the letter's second sentence, memory speaking softly as if from behind a door. I asked the porter, idling with a cloth near the notice board, about the costume society. "Thursdays," he said, with the delicate pride of a man who knew something before we asked. I said we were looking for a garment that remembered blue. He considered, then admitted the wardrobing lived in a cellar off the hall. He had a key, and a superstition about lending it. Back in the quad, rain wandered in from Broad Street and laid its hands on the stone. Students crossed with that academic haste which is swiftness without destination. Lewis asked what, if anything, had become clearer. That the college tells its story in footnotes, I said, and that Mellor liked the sound of other people's sentences. He asked whether Voss was protecting him or herself. The photograph suggested both. "And Hartley," he said. "Hartley carries perforations in his pockets," I said. "He tears life where the paper advises, and still the edge phrase." We paused at the gatehouse. The porter looked satisfied to have our names twice in his book. Lewis asked if any of this would float a charge. "Not yet," I said, though somewhere between a missing page and a misremembered poet, a current had begun to tug. The piano faltered behind us, and then, with shy bravery, found its note. Rain had thinned to a whisper by the time Lewis and I stood in the porter's lodge again, the day not quite willing to reveal itself. He had been speaking with one of the scouts who swore she had glimpsed a woman in a blue cloak near Mellor's staircase on the night in question. A colour in Oxford is never merely a colour. It carries banners, loyalties, college scarves, and the faint perfume of associations. Blue could mean anything or nothing. Still, the scout's voice, relayed to me second-hand, had trembled with the stubborn certainty of servants who keep better records than fellows. Lewis thought costume society again, his suspicion turning practical. He had already copied a list of members, each name written in the brisk script of undergraduates who believed rehearsal schedules to be a matter of destiny. I watched the list flutter slightly in his hand, and told him that rehearsals are louder than crimes, and that no thief ever performs in the costume assigned. He frowned, but pocketed the paper. Mellor's rooms retained their unease. The window had been opened for cleansing, and the damp smell of disinfectant now argued with the books. I returned to the Keats. The missing page troubled me more than any corpse. I turned the volume over again, and in the gutter of the binding I found the faint indentation of a letter. Once present, now gone. It had pressed itself against the paper as all words eventually do. I traced the outline with my thumb, unable to decipher the shape, but certain it was not a mere fold. Someone had left a ghost behind. At Hall that evening, I dined among the survivors. The college had its usual theatre. Silver just burnished enough, Latin grace murmured without belief. Fellows arranged as if painted centuries earlier. I sat opposite Helena Voss. She wore a dark dress that lent her face the pallor of porcelain, and she observed me with that measured curiosity of a woman accustomed to scrutiny. I asked what she made of Mellor's scholarship. She replied that he had been generous in praise, less so in acknowledgement. Her fork paused, then resumed with clinical precision. I asked whether she considered generosity a virtue. "Only when it remembers itself," she answered, and her eyes did not move from mine. Lewis, beside me, attempted small talk about football. Voss dismissed it with a glance that reduced him to silence. She preferred higher games. She spoke then of Coleridge, of memory's peculiar talent for betrayal. "A misquoted poet," she said, "is a window into the soul of the quoter." I felt the observation brush too close to Mellor's annotated copy. She drank no wine, though the glass before her had been poured. The untouched crimson reflected the candles as if recording absences. Later, I walked the quadrangle alone. A figure in a cloak crossed the arch, but when I drew near it proved a gown, black in poor light, the student within too young to have secrets worth killing for. Still, the image held. I thought of the scout's recollection. A cloak in blue. A color borrowed, perhaps, from a society's wardrobe, a disguise that meant to be seen. What kind of woman wants to be witnessed by silhouette alone? Lewis found me beneath the cloister. He muttered that Voss unsettled him, too polished, too calm. I reminded him that calmness hides as many storms as anger displays. He asked whether she had killed Mellor. I said the guilty often feed us better clues than the innocent, but they seldom look us in the eye while doing so. We left the college under a sky that had surrendered to night. I considered again the page removed from Keats, the ghostly impression left behind, and Voss's remark at dinner about memory's betrayals. A woman in blue, a page excised, a scholar drowned. I could not yet make them one picture, but I felt the pieces had already arranged themselves in secret, waiting for me to look at them from a different angle. The porter sent us to a seminar room above a scuffed lawn. Michael Hartley waited very still. Pale from the library's weather, he held a folder. Before we asked, he said Mellor had liked his work rather too much. I asked how much was too much. He said an idea can be borrowed, but cadence cannot, and Mellor had begun to write in his sentences with the complacency of ownership. His hand rested on the folder the way a father steadies a child. Lewis pressed him on timings and drafts. Hartley answered patiently, then impatiently, then carefully again, his anger learning manners as it moved. The room was overheated. On the notice board, a sheet announced the Costume Society, Thursday nights, blue ink. I thought of the thread from Mellor's stairwell and set it beside the anonymous letter in my mind. He left no trace. She knew his secret. Secrets here seldom travel alone. Each belongs to a family. Hartley said he had given Mellor a chapter weeks earlier, only to hear its sentences in a conference paper under another name. He had complained to no one. Complaints age badly in colleges and turn against their authors. I asked whether anyone else knew. Dr. Voss knows everything she chooses to know and nothing she does not, he said. Asked about the night of Mellor's death, he spoke of a tutorial that had not happened, a door that remained closed, footsteps on stairs that might have been his own memory checking itself. He went home, he said, and wrote late. Alone, and still listening. I asked to see his folder. He hesitated the amount that good people hesitate. Inside, the pages were ruled and perforated. One leaf bore the ragged edge of recent tearing. He said he had removed an unsatisfactory paragraph that morning. I touched the torn margin and felt the small burr paper grows when a decision is made too quickly. The correspondence between textures grew insistent. Lewis asked whether he had ever threatened Mellor. Threats belong to the talentless, he said. I believed him, not because the remark was noble, but because it was conceited, and conceit tends to be accurate about itself. He said he had confronted Mellor once in the library by not confronting him at all, standing in silence until Mellor noticed and left with a joke too thin to hide behind. The college day moved on without us, distant feet and a bell. Hartley asked if the accusation now belonged to him. Accusation is a homeless thing, I told him, and sleeps wherever the room is warmest. What will you do? He asked. Look again at what is missing and who arranged the absence. We left him to his pages. Outside, Broad Street wore a skim of drizzle like an unconvincing alibi. Lewis asked if I believed the boy. Belief is a candle, I said. It shows you the room while blinding you to the night. But yes, I believed him enough to keep him close. I walked later along the canal where water remembers differently from stone. Swans argued in whispers. I thought about the misquoted poet in Mellor's notes, the page removed from Keats, the blue that kept returning as if color had motives. On the towpath a car idled, a forgettable thing whose number plate pricked at memory. I had seen it a day too early and a yard too near. It rolled away as I approached. Back in my flat, I poured a thin whiskey and set the fragments in a rough order. Mellor's theft, Voss's precision without warmth, Hartley's pride without armor, a cloak that asked to be noticed, a letter that refused to show its hands. The crossword waited. A clue I had ignored read, borrowed light shows true color when overcast. I wrote refraction and rubbed it out. The better answer arrived late and ordinary. Exposure. Sleep came badly. I dreamed of a page tearing itself from a book, while a woman in a blue cloak watched me fail to stop it. Waking before dawn, I found the word exposure where the dream had left it, patient as rain on stone. The house where Claire Mellor lived stood back from the road, a polite Georgian facade that suggested more restraint than welcome. The curtains were half drawn, though the afternoon was not yet tired, and the brass knocker had been polished recently, as if grief required gleam. Lewis rang, and after a pause that seemed measured against propriety, the door opened. She was younger than I had expected. Not young in years, but in composure, the kind of woman who had learned to carry sorrow like a carefully chosen accessory. She invited us inside with the formality of someone aware that every word spoken might later be quoted against her. The sitting room was as composed as its occupant. No flowers, no photographs, beyond one cautious frame on the mantelpiece. No lingering disorder to betray how life had been before it was interrupted. She asked if we would take tea, though her voice suggested she hoped we would not. Lewis accepted with enthusiasm. I declined. She spoke of Adrian as a man who had lived for his college, for his books, for the dignity of his post. The sentences had the stiffness of rehearsal. She used the word devoted twice, too close together, as if trying to convince herself of its accuracy. I asked what he had been devoted to beyond his college. She allowed the silence to stretch before saying music, sometimes poetry, and occasionally, though less than he should have, to her. Lewis asked gently about the night of his death. She lowered her eyes and said she had not been there. She had been visiting her sister in Banbury. The detail was offered without invitation, but too swiftly, as if memorized. I asked whether her husband had enemies. She gave a small smile that resembled fatigue more than amusement. Adrian inspired irritation more easily than affection, she said. But murder seemed a word too large for his circle. While she poured tea for Lewis, my eyes drifted to the mantelpiece photograph. Adrian Mellor stood in the center, his expression somewhere between confidence and apology. Beside him was Helena Voss, unmistakably younger, leaning a fraction closer than convention required. Claire noticed my attention. She said it was taken years before she married him, that they had been colleagues and nothing more. The tone was composed, but her fingers tightened on the teapot lid until the knuckles whitened. I asked whether she liked Dr. Voss. She said admiration was safer than friendship. Lewis shifted uncomfortably in his chair, as if the air had grown suddenly close. On a shelf by the window, books were arranged in neat symmetry. I drew out one at random, a volume of Hardy's poems. Inside the front cover was an inscription in Mellor's hand, "To Claire, who endures what she should not have to." She said she had forgotten it was there. Her voice faltered only slightly, but enough to suggest that endurance had not ended with marriage. We took our leave soon after. At the door, she asked whether we would find the person responsible. The question sounded more like ritual than hope. Her eyes met mine with that unsettling calm I have seen in people who already know the answer to questions they dare not articulate. Outside, the air smelled of damp brick and early evening. Lewis said she was beautiful. I said beauty rarely testifies. He said he believed her alibi. I said belief once more was a candle in a draught. As we walked back to the car, I kept thinking of the inscription in Hardy, of endurance written as both gift and reproach, and of the photograph with Voss too near. In the crossword that evening, a clue read, "Word for bearing, what cannot be borne. 8. I wrote patience and crossed it out. The correct answer, I realized with reluctant certainty, was forbear. And Claire Meller, polished grief and all, had forborne more than she wished to confess. Noon arrived with insolence, the skies scrubbed clean as if Oxford had repented. Lewis said we ought to get on with the obvious. The obvious wore Professor Channing's tweed. He received us in rooms that smelt of polish and patience. He asked what progress had been made, and I said, progress is usually the elegant rearrangement of error. Lewis offered the arithmetic of opportunity. The gap after hall, the empty corridor, the stair. Channing said he spent that interval drafting a letter of recommendation. A paper knife aligned with the desk's edge suggested habit rather than haste. We left with a motive walking neatly beside us. Thwarted preferment, the old quarrel about committees and shelves. A cyclist's bell in the quad sounded like a verdict. "It will be tidy," he said. "Tidy," I told him, "belongs to coroners and decorators." Yet I felt the lure. I built it in my head, Channing at the stair, Meller in his bath, a lecture about standards becoming a hand upon a shoulder, the slow collapse of a body that trusted porcelain. The cloak on the landing, theatricals, the anonymous letter, a postgraduate's conscience, more poetry than proof, the missing page from Keats, mischief or modesty. Even the number plate by the canal could be his. The mind furnishes faces for any silhouette. Lewis, who trusts silhouettes, drove us to the police garage where a student had gnawed a parked car and left contrition. The log recorded plates. One matched the figure that had worried me by the canal. The car belonged, however, to the college pool, bookable by fellows and favored graduates. "Still fits," Lewis said. "Plausibility," I answered, "is a solvent that leaves only surface." Back at St. Anselm's, I returned to Milor's rooms. Dust had organized itself into ministries. The hearth held a crescent of ash. I teased it with 2 fingers and found not paper but a thin blue ribbon fused to a brittle twist. The college uses ivory library slips. Blue belongs to the Bodleian. Meller, or someone near him, had let a book wander. The porter, shown the color, smiled with the pride of a doorkeeper who knows a little scandal. Meller treated the Bodleian as an annex, sir. There were letters about overdue volumes. I signed the visitor's book and thought of the missing page in Keats. The indentation on the facing leaf was narrow, like the pressure of ruled paper. Meller's notebooks were unruled, creamy. The ghost upon Keats came from elsewhere. Lewis telephoned from the gate. A scout remembered Channing returning late the night of the death. Hat damp, shoes not. In this city, wetness confesses before people do. I almost surrendered to it. Then I looked again at the blue ribbon and felt the case shift its weight. Channing owns his books and borrows people. He would sooner quote Virgil than queue for a public desk. The ribbon spoke of hurried need, of someone who does not belong and must belong quickly. We asked Channing to the office. He accepted the recital of motive as a don accepts minutes. He did not dispute. He amended. When I mentioned the Bodleian, contempt crossed his face like a brief cloud. "I own what I read," he said, and read what I own. "You are close," he added, "to the wrong inference made perfectly." Evening gathered its minor keys. The chapel organ practiced a tune that could not decide whether to forgive. We had furniture enough for a charge, means, motive, opportunity, and a corridor that echoed like agreement. But furniture points where it is arranged. I thought of the crossword, a clue I had saved. Guide that misleads when followed exactly. I wrote pattern, erased it, and wrote decoy. The false trail is courteous. It carries your coat, shows you to a seat, allows you a window. I let it briefly, then turned back to the hearth where the blue twist lay like a vein. The room did not smell of sherry or varnish or books. It smelt of soap, the kind used by people who wash away what they have written. Someone had torn a page too carefully, and the carefulness mattered more than the tear. The porter produced a key that seemed older than the door it claimed to serve, and Lewis and I stepped into the college library where silence had been domesticated. Dust made the air taste metallic, like coins on the tongue. I moved through the rows without hurry, my fingertips grazing bindings as if they might confess. Mellor had borrowed little from his own shelves, less still from the college's, yet in the ledger his name had been inked against a slim volume of minor verse, withdrawn, never returned. I traced the column with my thumb. The name above his had been written, erased, and overwritten in another hand. Hartley's neat scrawl, blurred with a residue of guilt. Lewis muttered that pencils betray as much as people. I said they betray more often, because they are certain of erasure. We carried the ledger to the desk beneath the arched window. I held it at an angle. The erased name was not Mellor's, but a woman's. Faint, but legible. I did not speak it aloud. Lewis asked if it mattered. I said names matter less than who decides to rub them away. The book itself had vanished. A clerk confirmed it had not been reshelled, not misplaced, simply absent. Mellor had signed for it, but never returned it. The anonymous letter stirred again in my mind, 2 lines that refused to separate. He left no trace. She knew his secret. Perhaps the secret lay between covers, thin enough to slip into a pocket, thick enough to trouble a conscience. That evening in my flat, I set the ledger beside the crossword. A clue read, forgotten verse recast with hidden name, 9. I wrote anagram and crossed it out. I considered pseudonym. The answer, reluctantly, was palimpsest. A word for writing that refuses to die, scraped away but visible still. I thought of the erased entry in the ledger and of the faint indentation left behind in Mellor's Keats, different surfaces carrying the same absence. Lewis telephoned before I could pour whiskey. He had searched Mellor's desk again and found a half-burnt page in the hearth, brittle with regret. It mentioned the blue cloak and something about Helena's warning. He asked what it meant. I said warnings seldom arrive in their proper tense. They come either too early to be believed or too late to be useful. I returned to the college the next day. The library smelled of old ink and wet stone. In the corner, the librarian rearranged returns with priestly delicacy. I asked whether Mellor often came late in the evening. She said yes, always after hall, sometimes alone, sometimes with company. Did she know which company? She looked away as if the shelves required sudden attention. On the desk near the catalogue lay a scrap of paper used as a bookmark, a student's timetable, ink smudged by a thumb. But beneath the schedule, someone had idly written a fragment of verse, a line misremembered from Coleridge. Life is but a vision, not dream, not shadow. Vision, the same distortion Mellor had scribbled in his notes, a private misquotation moving from hand to hand, like a shared key. I placed the scrap back where it had been, nothing removed, nothing added, only observed. When I left, the chapel bell rehearsed its toll, and the stone paths were damp with mist. Lewis walked beside me, convinced that the false trail was vanishing and that at last we were near the truth. I said, truth is not near or far. It is like a book missing from the shelf, its absence shaping the silence around it. That night, the ledger haunted me. A name erased, a book withdrawn, a page torn, a cloak glimpsed. Nothing whole, everything interrupted. I lay awake, thinking of palimpsests and how every crime is written over another, never entirely erased. The cloister kept a private cold, as if stone stored winter for the faithful. We went to evensong, because Oxford admits more in song than in statement. I stood near the north wall where drafts learn Latin and let the lamps arrange their small consolations on the glass. 2 rows ahead, Helena Voss held herself like a theorem proved once and for all. The psalm passed, the lesson followed, and then Milton arrived with his patient music. I watched her mouth the line, calm and exact, and then, so small the ears might pardon it, she gave they also serve who stand and wait. The only dropped away like a coin, heard but not seen. A little word, but it keeps the humility in place. Afterward, the college misted out of the chapel with well-bred relief. Lewis asked if the music had improved my temper. The altos had worked too hard, I said, and one word had worked harder by being absent. Which word, he wanted to know. Later I told him, and crossed the grass where rain lifted from the earth as if the ground were trying not to cry. On such evenings, Oxford looks pencil-drawn, then rubbed gently with a thumb. I left Lewis to soften the porter with football and climbed Mellor's staircase alone. The rooms had become a museum of what people mean to keep. Cupboards resisted with courtesy. Books refused to fall open at their favorites. I ignored the theatrical Keats on the desk and reached instead for a dull collection of essays whose spine sighed in my hands. Between chapters, folded with the timidity of theft, lay a single leaf of ruled paper, not part of the book, a stowaway. The hand was Mellor's, but the sentences borrowed another voice, cooler, more certain. It spoke of a borrowed thought made property by praise, of a woman who would not forgive the theft of what cannot be footnoted, of secrecy negotiated between vanity and fear. I read it twice because honesty sometimes hides in repetition. At the window, the cloister showed a car shouldering itself into its bay. The plate nudged whatever had been pacing in my head since the canal path. I had seen those numbers wear river light and indecision. Earlier, the porter had allowed me the garage log written in clerical blue, a list of reservations without romance. On the night that mattered, the widow's name sat in the margin with the innocence of a shopping list. Errands first, late return after. Courtesy softened nothing. Lewis was still in the lodge explaining patience to a man who had perfected it. He saw my face and saved his question for later. Our scrap of blue is losing its color, I told him. He tried the widow's name as though placing it on a plaque. The widow or her shadow, I said, and asked for the book again to make the moment official. The porter enjoyed unlocking rules for us, the key turning with the vanity of brass. Back in Mellor's rooms, I sat on the arm of a chair and listened to the plumbing rehearse the past. Old houses keep verbs if you will hear them. Bath run. Pause. Quiet. Not the tidy ending of abandonment, but the quiet that follows conversation. There is a visit that ends inside a sentence and leaves the room to accept responsibility. I traced the chalk pale ring the water had made round the bath, a hesitant halo. Beside it, on the small table, I set the stowaway page. Beside that, I set the wrong Milton in Helena's mouth. Beside that, I set the cloak that wished to be seen in blue. The crossword folded in my pocket had waited all day with an unfashionable clue. Little word that alters everything. 4. I wrote only, and felt the hinge in the case move a fraction. We left as the choristers bundled their music with the tidy piety that evaporates by Tuesday. In the cloister, Helena passed with the stillness of someone pretending to walk. Our eyes met. "You heard it," hers said. Mine replied that I had heard it before she had. A scholar will forgive theft sooner than correction. Behind her, candle smoke unstitched itself from the air. Halfway to the car, Lewis asked for a conclusion he could carry without spilling. We had reached only the hinge, I told him. Doors are uninteresting until they open, and indispensable after. He asked where morning ought to find us. "At the widow's house," I said. "At the canal where the number remembers itself. At the garage where clerical blue does not lie by accident." The bell in the tower shook out a measured sorrow. The city returned it intact and kept the echo for later. Morning began without appetite. The city lay under a film of mist, every spire muted, as though Oxford itself preferred to speak in ellipses. Lewis drove with his usual optimism, humming tunelessly. I asked him to stop by the canal. The path was slick, the water muddied, and the air smelled of iron and rot. The same car had idled here the night I wandered alone. The plate in the garage log had matched, and now, in daylight, the memory refused to loosen. Claire Mellor's name in clerical blue ink stood beside the date of her husband's death, calm as a prayer request. We went on to her house. She received us with the same studied composure, a black dress that seemed less mourning than uniform. She said she had been in Banbury. Her sister would confirm it. Lewis accepted the words. I did not. She poured tea with hands too steady for grief. I asked about the cloak, whether she had ever attended the costume society. She smiled faintly, a smile that begged us to underestimate it. "No," she said. "Such things belong to students." But her eyes drifted, a fraction too long, towards the wardrobe at the corner of the room. When she left briefly for milk, I moved to the mantelpiece. The Hardy volume still waited, its inscription as heavy as a verdict. To Claire, who endures what she should not have to. I thought of the letter. He left no trace. She knew his secret and wondered whether endurance had finally run its course. She returned and spoke of her husband's devotion to work, of his absences, of his pride. The words were practiced, but her voice faltered when she said he had been careless with affections. Lewis looked away, embarrassed by candor. I asked if she had loved him. She set the cup down carefully, as though it might break in her hand. "Love is not the question," she said. "Endurance was." Later, back at the college, I sat in Mellor's rooms while the late sun crawled across the desk. The rescued leaf of ruled paper lay before me, half-burnt, its sentences faint. It spoke of a woman's humiliation, of theft both personal and intellectual, of a night when endurance failed. I read it twice, then again, until the phrasing felt less like Mellor's than like an echo of another hand. Lewis entered with news. Hartley had written the anonymous letters. His guilt over Mellor's plagiarism had driven him to hint rather than accuse. He confessed readily when pressed. But, Lewis added, he swore he had not seen Mellor that night. The letters were warnings, not condemnations. I believed him. His arrogance was too honest to permit perjury. Evening drew in. I returned to Claire. The house was dim, the air close. I asked her where the cloak was. She said she had no idea. I told her it had been found in the college cellar, returned quietly after the funeral. I watched her expression, the small pause between breath and answer. She asked if I wished her to confess. I said nothing. Confession is an untidy instrument. Silence is sharper. She began to speak of betrayal, of finding pages not his own in her husband's drafts, of discovering an old affair rekindled with the woman in blue, Helena Voss. She said she had gone to confront him, intending only shame, not death. The bath was running, the quarrel sharpened, his foot slipped. She left him there, stunned, perhaps still alive. She took the cloak because it was near, because she did not want to be recognized, because humiliation likes costumes. Lewis waited in the car while I listened. Her words had the stillness of inevitability. I thought of the crossword folded in my pocket, a clue from the morning paper. What truth does when hidden too long? 7. The answer came easily this time. Surface. When I left her, the lamps along the road had already blurred into the mist. She stood framed in the doorway, neither guilty nor innocent, simply enduring still. The truth had surfaced, but like all things dredged from water, it carried more silt than clarity. Morning arrived without theatre, diluted light that ironed Oxford into pallor. Lewis brought coffee and the kind of chair reserved for forms that can finally be filled. "Misadventure will do," he said, reading the weather in my face. I let the word find a chair. At St. Anselm's, the fellows crossed the quad as if rehearsing discretion. The porter thumbed his ledger, delighted by the prospect of a concluding entry. "Is it over?" his eyebrows asked. "Endings," I told him, "are conveniences, not facts." He wrote our names anyway, careful as sums. I went once more to Mellor's rooms. The towel had been changed, the bath shone, and the window let in air that had nothing to contribute. On the desk, the rescued leaf of ruled paper waited like a mild reproach. One verb had done disproportionate harm. Endure. It had travelled from the hardy inscription to the quiet sentences of a man now past explanation. Emotions learn our handwriting and forge our signatures. Lewis telephoned from the lodge. The superintendent would accept restraint. The boy had confessed to the letters and to nothing else. His guilt would be archived. Voss, he added, wore dignity like an accomplished cloak. She had tolerated enthusiasm and been paid in rumors. Tolerance, I said, is a power already spent, and closed the window on a draft that wanted to talk. Before the light thinned, I walked to the canal. The water remembered wheels and whispered quarrels. I stood where the college car had loitered and counted the steps from the towpath to Mellor's stair. It is the distance a humiliated person can walk without planning to forgive. The arithmetic of disgrace uses small numbers and repeats them until they sound reasonable. The coroner disliked drama and liked wording. Accidental death following a domestic altercation, his pen decided, and the city exhaled. I wondered whether justice had been reduced to good manners. Some cases end with a sentence, some end with a cadence. This one preferred music to verdicts. Later, I visited Claire. The house had learned a new tidiness, the kind that performs itself. "Will there be charges?" she asked, and the question sounded like housekeeping. "The world has accepted what it wants to accept," I said. "I did not try to kill him," she answered, and I believed her, though belief is a tenancy and the lease is short. We sat in a room undecided between living and remembering. Endurance had felt like love until it didn't, she said, and left the rest unbuilt. On my way out, I noticed gloves drying on the radiator, cheap wool, cuffs turned back with domestic economy. One finger had been darned in neat blue. Blue again, humbler than the cloak, almost apologetic. We live inside our motifs until they stop asking for attention. I touched the wool. It was warm from washing. Water allows certain histories to pretend they never occurred. That evening, Lewis brought takeaway and innocence. "We did well by the city," he said. "The city prefers to do well by itself," I told him. "What will linger?" he asked. "A word from a crossword," I said. "Learned too late." "Not silence this time." "Forbear." He laughed with the generosity of men who do not require the last word, and I let him take it. After he left, I poured a minor whiskey and played an aria that remembers more than it tells. A phrase returned after a long absence, altered by having travelled. So with us. Hartley would learn humility at the pace of weathering. Voss would maintain her careful altitude. The porter would cherish his keys because they proved doors still existed. Mella, more careless than cruel, had been taken by water that owed him nothing. Before sleep, I wrote in the crossword margin, a childish habit I no longer apologize for. What remains when nothing remains? My first answer had been silence. The better answer, crueler and more accurate, was memory, which is silence that refuses obedience. I set down the pen and listened to old stones slowly turning in their sleep. Night kept one secret and did not say whose. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. Important info. Important info. Important info. Important info. Important info.